Steve Harvey had been hosting Family Feud for nearly 2 decades, and while he had been moved to tears on numerous occasions, he had always managed to maintain enough composure to continue with the show. But on that overcast January afternoon in 2026, a 92-year-old man named Thomas Bennett would share something so profoundly tender, so achingly beautiful in its expression of lifelong love and the mystery of human connection, that Steve's eyes would well up with tears he couldn't control, his voice would fail him completely, and everyone in the studio would find themselves witnessing not a tale of tragedy or shocking revelation, but something perhaps even more powerful: the simple, devastating testimony of a man who had experienced something on the day his wife died that he couldn't explain and couldn't forget, something that had sustained him through 5 years of grief, and that he needed to share before he joined her. 2 families stood ready to compete: the Harrison family from Michigan and the Bennett family from Vermont. The Bennett family immediately drew attention because at their center stood Thomas Bennett, a remarkably tall 92-year-old man who still stood nearly 6 feet, despite the stoop of age, with thick white hair, piercing gray, blue eyes, and a gentle dignity that commanded respect. He wore a navy cardigan over a crisp white shirt, and around his neck hung a silver chain with 2 wedding rings, his own and a smaller one that clearly had belonged to his late wife. His family surrounded him with obvious devotion: 4 generations including his daughter Catherine, who was in her late 60s, his grandchildren in their 40s, his great-grandchildren who were teenagers and young adults, and even a great-great-grandchild, a toddler who kept reaching for Poppy Thomas's hand. During the pre-interview, Thomas had been articulate and warm, answering questions with a thoughtful precision that showed a mind still sharp despite his advanced years. When asked about his late wife, his face had transformed with such visible love and longing that the producers had been immediately moved. He had said, "My wife Margaret died 5 years ago this month, after 68 years of marriage. And I need to tell people what happened on the day she died, because I've carried it alone for 5 years, and I think it's time to share it. Not because it's shocking or scandalous, but because it's the most beautiful thing that ever happened to me, and because it might bring comfort to someone else who's grieving." The producers had assumed he meant a touching deathbed conversation or a meaningful goodbye, not understanding the profound mystery he was preparing to reveal. Thomas's daughter Catherine, when asked about her mother's death, had said with obvious emotion, "My mother's death was peaceful and expected. She was 90 years old, and her health had been declining for months. What none of us understood was what happened to Dad that day, something he only told me about recently, something that changed him in ways we couldn't quite articulate, but could all see." The Bennett family won their game with strong teamwork, Thomas contributing several thoughtful answers that made Steve compliment his wisdom and quick thinking. As they lined up for fast money, there was no question that Thomas would be one of the 2 players, despite his family's gentle concern about whether the rapid-fire questions might be too demanding for someone his age. Thomas had insisted, saying with quiet determination, "I came here to speak at that podium to honor Margaret by telling what happened, and I'm not leaving without doing that." His great-grandson went first and scored 187 points, which meant Thomas needed only 13 points to win the $20,000. Virtually guaranteed. But as Thomas slowly approached the podium, moving with careful dignity, Steve noticed that the old man's composure was already breaking, that his hand was touching the 2 wedding rings at his throat, and that tears were forming in his eyes before a single question had been asked. Steve approached him with his characteristic warmth, immediately sensing something significant was happening, and said gently, "Mr. Bennett, you all right, sir? You need a moment?" Thomas shook his head but didn't speak immediately, his fingers clutching the rings at his neck. The studio fell into that particular profound silence that happens when everyone senses they're about to witness something important. Finally, Thomas looked up at Steve and said in a voice that quavered with emotion, "Mr. Harvey, before we play this game, I need to tell you about the day my wife Margaret died. I need to tell you about something that happened that I can't explain, something that sustained me through 5 years of grief, and something that I think people need to hear. because it might give them hope that love doesn't end with death, that connection persists in ways we don't understand, and that the people we love are never truly gone. Steve's expression shifted immediately from entertainer to deeply present human being, and he said quietly, "Sir, whatever you need to share, we're listening." Thomas took a shaking breath, his hand still touching the wedding rings, and he began to speak. What he shared over the next 20 minutes would be one of the most tender, mysterious, and deeply moving stories ever told on television, would leave Steve Harvey unable to continue with tears streaming down his face, and would ultimately become a story shared by millions of people seeking comfort in grief and hope that love transcends death. Thomas said, "My wife Margaret and I were married for 68 years. We met in 1951 when we were both 19 years old at a church social in Burlington, Vermont. I saw her across the room and I told my friend, 'I'm going to marry that girl,' and he laughed at me because we hadn't even spoken yet. But I was right. We were married a year later in 1952, and we had 68 years together, 68 years of love and laughter and partnership and the occasional argument, but mostly just deep, abiding love that defined both of our lives." The studio was completely silent, everyone transfixed by the obvious depth of Thomas's emotion. He continued, "Margaret was diagnosed with congestive heart failure in 2019, when she was 88 years old. The doctors told us she had maybe a year, maybe 2 if she was lucky, and that we should prepare for her decline and eventual death. Those next 2 years were the hardest of my life, watching the woman I loved slowly weaken, seeing her struggle to breathe, knowing that every day together was one day closer to losing her. But they were also precious years, because we both knew our time was limited, and we spent it telling each other all the things we'd always known, but needed to say out loud. We said, 'I love you,' 100 times a day. We held hands constantly. We talked about our life together, about our children and grandchildren, about the memories we'd made, and about how grateful we were for 68 years when so many people never get even a fraction of that." Thomas paused, his voice breaking, and Steve moved closer to him, his own eyes already glistening with tears. Thomas continued, "In January 2021, Margaret's health deteriorated rapidly. We knew the end was near, and our family gathered at our home where we had set up hospice care in our bedroom. The same bedroom we'd shared for 58 years, the same bed we'd slept in together for all those decades. The hospice nurse told us it was a matter of days, maybe hours, and that we should say our goodbyes. Our daughter Catherine, our grandchildren, they all came and spent time with Margaret, told her they loved her, thanked her for being such a wonderful mother and grandmother, and then they left us alone, Margaret and me, in our bedroom, for one final night together." The emotion in the studio was palpable, many people already crying, and Steve's face showed he was deeply affected. Thomas said, "Margaret was mostly unconscious by this point, the morphine keeping her comfortable, but occasionally she would squeeze my hand or open her eyes briefly. I lay next to her in our bed, the way we'd slept together for 68 years, and I held her hand and talked to her. I told her everything. How much I loved her, how grateful I was for our life together, how proud I was of the family we'd built, how beautiful she still was to me even at 90 years old with her body failing. I told her it was okay to go, that I would be all right, that I would see her again someday, and I told her that I would love her forever, that death couldn't change that, and that no matter where she went, I would always be connected to her." Thomas's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and everyone in the studio leaned forward to hear him. He said, "Around 3 in the morning, Margaret's breathing changed. The hospice nurse had told me this would happen, that when death was very close, the breathing would become irregular, would slow down, and would eventually stop. I held Margaret close, my face against hers, my hand on her heart, and I talked to her softly, telling her I loved her, telling her I was there, telling her she wasn't alone. And then, just as her breathing was slowing toward that final moment, something extraordinary happened, something I can't explain and something I'll never forget." The studio was absolutely silent, everyone holding their breath, and Steve's face showed he was completely absorbed in Thomas's story. Thomas said, his voice filled with wonder, I felt Margaret's hand, which had been limp and still for hours, suddenly squeeze mine with surprising strength, not just a reflexive squeeze, but a firm, deliberate pressure, the way she'd squeezed my hand thousands of times over our 8 years together. And at the exact same moment, I heard her voice, not out loud, not with my ears, but inside my mind, inside my heart, as clearly as if she were speaking to me. She said, "Thomas, I can see everything. It's so beautiful. Don't be afraid. I'll wait for you." Just those words, spoken not in a whisper, but in the strong, young voice she'd had when we first met, full of life and love and certainty. And then her hand relaxed, her breathing stopped, and she was gone. The gasps that went through the studio were audible, but they weren't gasps of shock at something disturbing. They were gasps of wonder and of recognition, as if many people were hearing something they had hoped might be true, but had never dared to believe. Steve Harvey's face was streaming with tears, and he made no attempt to wipe them away, just standing there completely absorbed in Thomas's testimony. Thomas continued, "I know what people will think. I know they'll say it was grief, or stress, or my imagination, or some kind of neurological phenomenon that happens when you're watching someone die. But I know what I experienced. I know I felt Margaret's hand squeeze mine with deliberate strength. I know I heard her voice, not thought I heard, but actually heard, telling me she could see everything, and that it was beautiful, and that she would wait for me. That experience, those words, they were as real as anything I've ever experienced in 92 years of life. And they changed everything." Thomas looked directly at the camera and said, "For 5 years, I've lived with that moment as my most precious memory. When people ask me how I'm managing after losing my wife, how I'm surviving the grief and the loneliness, I tell them about that moment. I tell them that Margaret told me she'd wait for me, that death is beautiful rather than frightening, and that the connection we built over 8 years didn't end when her body stopped working. I don't know how to explain it in scientific or religious terms. I'm not a mystic or a spiritual person in any formal sense. I'm just a man who loved his wife with everything in him, and who was given a gift in her final moment. A gift of knowing that she was okay, that she was somewhere, and that I'll see her again." Steve Harvey tried to speak but couldn't form words, his throat too tight with emotion. He just shook his head in wonder and grief, tears continuing to stream down his face. Thomas said, "I'm sharing this story publicly because I think there are millions of people who are grieving, who've lost someone they loved deeply, and who are terrified that death means permanent separation, that they'll never see their person again, that all those years of love just end and disappear into nothing. I can't prove that's not true. I can't scientifically demonstrate that Margaret still exists somewhere or that we'll be reunited. But I can tell you what I experienced, and I can tell you that it sustained me through 5 years of grief that should have destroyed me. I wake up every day without the woman I loved for 8 years, I eat meals alone, I sleep in an empty bed. I go through life knowing I'll never hold her hand or hear her laugh or see her smile again in this life. But I also go through each day knowing that she told me she'd wait for me, and I believe her. And that belief, that hope, that knowledge that our story isn't finished, it makes the grief bearable." Catherine, Thomas's daughter, stepped forward with tears streaming down her face and said, "Dad told me about this experience a few months after Mom died, and I didn't know what to think. But I've watched him over the last 5 years, and I've seen that whatever happened that night, it changed him. He's not just surviving grief. He has a peace about him, a certainty that he'll see Mom again, and it's given him strength that I don't think he'd have otherwise. Whether it was a real spiritual experience or some kind of brain phenomenon, it doesn't matter, because it's real to him and it's helped him live these last 5 years with hope instead of despair." Steve finally found his voice, though it was shaking badly, and he said, "Mr. Bennett, that is the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. I don't know how to explain what you experienced, and I don't think I need to, because what matters is that you felt your wife's presence in her final moment, and you received a message that has carried you through 5 years of grief. That's extraordinary, sir, and I'm honored that you chose to share it here." Thomas nodded and said, "I'm 92 years old, Mr. Harvey, and I know I don't have much time left. And I'm not afraid, because I know Margaret is waiting for me, just like she said she would be. I'm actually looking forward to dying, not because life isn't good anymore. My family brings me joy every day, but because dying means finally getting to hold Margaret's hand again, getting to see her smile, getting to tell her I kept my promise to live well, and to love our family, and to wait patiently until it was my turn to join her. Thomas touched the 2 wedding rings around his neck and said, I wear Margaret's ring with mine, so that she's always close to my heart, and so that every day I'm reminded of her promise. When I die, I want these rings to be buried with me, or better yet, I want to be cremated with them so that they're part of my ashes, so that when my ashes are mixed with Margaret's, which is what I've requested, our rings will be together again just like we'll be together again. That's my faith, that's my hope, and that's what I wanted to share today, because if even one person hears this story and finds comfort in their own grief, if even one person feels a little less afraid of death, or a little more hopeful that they'll see their loved ones again, then telling this story was worth it. The studio erupted in applause mixed with tears, and Steve Harvey couldn't continue. He tried several times to speak, to move forward with the show, but he was too overcome with emotion. Production paused for 15 minutes while Steve composed himself, and when cameras resumed, he announced that the Bennett family would receive the $20,000 without playing fast money, and that he was adding another $50,000 from his personal foundation to honor Thomas and Margaret's love story and to support the family. He said, Mr. Bennett, in 20 years of hosting this show, I have never been more moved by anything I've heard. You've given us all a gift today, the gift of hearing about deep, enduring love, about a mysterious moment that defies explanation but that speaks to something we all hope is true, and about faith and hope sustaining someone through unbearable loss. Thank you for sharing Margaret's final words to you, and thank you for showing us what 68 years of love looks like. The episode that aired became a cultural phenomenon, watched by over 70 million people and shared millions of times on social media. The story of Thomas hearing Margaret's voice in her final moment, of her telling him she could see everything and that it was beautiful and that she'd wait for him, resonated deeply with people of all faiths and backgrounds. The show received hundreds of thousands of messages from viewers sharing their own experiences of mysterious moments with dying loved ones. Voices heard, presences felt, messages received that couldn't be explained but that brought profound comfort. Near-death researchers, hospice workers, and palliative care specialists wrote about how common these experiences actually are, how many people report similar phenomena surrounding death, and how such experiences, whether interpreted as spiritual events or neurological phenomena, provide genuine comfort and help people process grief. Religious leaders from multiple faiths discussed Thomas's experience in sermons and teachings, with some seeing it as evidence of the soul's survival after death and others interpreting it more metaphorically while still acknowledging its power to provide comfort. Neuroscientists discussed possible explanations for hearing a deceased person's voice, including the brain's creation of meaningful patterns during intense emotional experiences, while also acknowledging that such experiences, regardless of their mechanism, are subjectively real and deeply meaningful to those who have them. Grief counselors and therapists reported that Thomas's story had become a touchstone for their clients, something people referenced when trying to articulate their own hopes about death and reunion with loved ones. But perhaps the most significant response came from ordinary people who were grieving, who wrote to say that Thomas's story had given them hope when they felt hopeless, had helped them imagine that death might not be the end of love and connection, and had provided comfort in believing that they might see their deceased loved ones again. Many wrote about their own mysterious experiences surrounding death. A deceased parent's favorite song playing at a meaningful moment, a vivid dream that felt like visitation, a sense of presence or a feeling of being watched over by someone who had died. Thomas's willingness to share his experience publicly had given others permission to acknowledge and honor their own similar experiences, without fear of being dismissed or ridiculed. Thomas lived for another year after his appearance on Family Feud, dying peacefully in his sleep in February 2027 at the age of 93. In that final year, he received thousands of letters from people thanking him for sharing Margaret's final message, telling him how his story had helped them in their own grief, and expressing their belief that he would indeed be reunited with Margaret as she had promised. Thomas responded personally to as many letters as he could, always emphasizing that he couldn't prove what he had experienced was objectively real, but that it was subjectively real to him and had made the difference between despair and hope in his grief. He spent his final year surrounded by family, speaking often about Margaret and expressing repeatedly his lack of fear about dying because, as he said, "I'm not dying, I'm going home to Margaret, and she's been waiting for me for 6 years, and I'm finally going to be able to hold her again." Thomas's death, when it came, was exactly as peaceful as Margaret's had been. His daughter Catherine reported that in his final hours, Thomas was smiling, that he seemed to be seeing something beautiful, and that his last words were, "Margaret, I see you. I'm coming." Whether this was a genuine spiritual experience, a hallucination created by a dying brain, or some combination of both, Catherine said it didn't matter. What mattered was that her father died without fear, with joy and anticipation, believing he was being reunited with the woman he had loved for 68 years and had grieved for 6. She said, "If death can be beautiful, if dying can be something to anticipate rather than fear, then my father showed us that, and whether he's actually with my mother now, or whether he simply ceased to exist believing he would be with her, I'm grateful that he had that hope and that faith, and that it made his final years and his final moments peaceful." Thomas's funeral was held exactly 1 week after Margaret's birthday, a timing his family said he would have appreciated. His ashes were mixed with Margaret's ashes, which the family had kept in an urn waiting for this reunion, and the 2 wedding rings he had worn around his neck were placed in the urn with their combined ashes. The family chose to have the ashes scattered in the Vermont mountains where Thomas and Margaret had honeymooned in 1952, bringing their love story full circle. During the service, Catherine read from a letter her father had written shortly before his death, which said in part, "When I die, please don't be sad for me. Don't think of me as gone or lost. Think of me as finally home after 6 long years away from the person I love most. Margaret told me she'd wait for me, and I believe her, and I'm going to her with joy and anticipation. I'll still love all of you, my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, but I'm going where I belong, to Margaret's side, where I've belonged since I was 19 years old and saw her across that church social and knew she was the one. Our love didn't end when her body stopped working. It didn't end when my body stopped working, and if I'm right about what happens after death, it will never end. That's what I want you to remember. That real love, deep love, the kind of love Margaret and I built over 68 years, that kind of love doesn't end. It just changes form." Steve Harvey attended Thomas's funeral, and he spoke about how Thomas's story had affected him profoundly, had changed how he thought about love and death and grief, and had given him a deeper appreciation for the mystery of human consciousness and connection. He said that the moment when Thomas had shared Margaret's final words, "I can see everything. It's so beautiful. Don't be afraid. I'll wait for you," had been one of the most powerful moments of his career, and that he found himself thinking about those words often, especially when dealing with his own fears about death, or when trying to comfort people who were grieving. He said that Thomas had given a gift to millions of people by sharing something so deeply personal, by risking skepticism and ridicule to offer hope and comfort to those who were suffering loss. The story of Thomas and Margaret Bennett became a touchstone for discussions about love, death, grief, and the possibility of survival of consciousness after bodily death. It was cited in books about near-death experiences, in grief support materials, in hospice training, and in countless sermons and spiritual teachings. The phrase Margaret had spoken, "I can see everything, it's so beautiful, don't be afraid, I'll wait for you," became something that many dying people's families hoped to hear, something that brought comfort even in the absence of any such message, because it articulated what so many hoped death might be, not an ending but a transition to something beautiful, not a separation but a promise of eventual reunion. But perhaps most significantly, Thomas's story became a reminder that we live in a universe that still contains mystery, that not everything can be explained or measured or proven, and that sometimes the most important truths are subjective truths that can only be testified to rather than demonstrated. Whether Thomas truly heard Margaret's voice in some metaphysical sense, or whether his grief-stricken brain created an experience of hearing her voice, or whether something entirely different happened that we don't have language or concepts to describe, what mattered was that the experience was real to him, that it sustained him through 6 years of grief, and that it allowed him to face his own death with hope and joy rather than fear and despair. In the end, the story of Thomas Bennett and the day his wife died became a testimony not primarily about death, but about love so deep it sustained someone through decades of life and years of grief, about love that created bonds strong enough that even death felt like a temporary separation rather than a permanent ending, and about love that gave someone the courage to share a deeply personal and possibly inexplicable experience because it might comfort others in their own grief. Thomas's final gift to the world was not proof that consciousness survives death or that we'll be reunited with loved ones. He couldn't offer proof. His gift was hope, freely given to anyone who needed it, hope based on his own experience and his own faith, hope that maybe, just maybe, love really doesn't end, and that the people we love are indeed waiting for us somewhere, ready to welcome us home when our own time comes.